So good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everybody, all our participants, wherever you're coming from. I'm just looking on the side here, there's people pouring in from all over. So some of you it's morning and some of you it's evening and some of you it's lunchtime like it is here in Ireland. So it's good to see you all, you're more than welcome. And once again here with us to launch the Sustainable Progress Index for 2022. Just a bit of background on this. The Sustainable Development Goals were agreed by the United Nations back in 2015. And from that point on, we have produced, that is Social Justice Ireland has produced the Sustainable Progress Index annually. It ranks countries in Europe, the EU 15 up to this year. This year it becomes the EU 14, given that that the UK has left the European Union since our last version of this was published, at least the last version, the data for the last version. So I'll just introduce everybody and we'll then get more moving. First of all, we have Professor Charles Clarke, who's coming to us from New York. He has been teaching economics now for 35 years, and he's worked with labor unions and he's worked with all sorts of different organizations in historical preservation and environmental protection, and he's worked as an economic consultant for the Irish government and a lot of other things that he's done. He is a senior fellow and in the Vincentian Center for Church and Society in New York and within St. John's University, and he's a professor of economics in St. John's. There's a lot of other things I could say, I could add to that, because he's had a very illustrious career and an immense lot of publications as well. But what we are sort of very grateful to him here for is the fact that he has been very interested in the Sustainable Progress Index, particularly in recent years. And he's done a lot of work with Social Justice Ireland down the years. He's one of the main authors of this report today, as is Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, who's a lecturer in economics in UCC here in Clarke. And she received her PhD from the University of Aberdeen. And she has quite a range of interests and has done quite a substantial amount of work both in economics, but also in the whole policy area in Ireland. And she was at one stage on the government appointed group, the expert group on future skills needs. And she's also a former member of the Council of the National Centre for Performance and Partnership. So she's got quite a range of interests as well as the academic one. Combined, the third person here is Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland. She's economic and social analyst with Social Justice Ireland, and she's been with us for a number of years. She has a wide experience before coming here, in ranging from working in the law directly to being engaged in policy areas. Particularly in areas like the money advice and budgeting services and on the policy side of that. So we have, as I say, a very good, capable people who put this report together. I'll hand you over to them in 1 minute, because there's one thing that's I can say to all our participants, that the authors would be more than happy to deal with any questions that arise. So you should be able to see the Q&A function there in the on the screen, and we would ask you to just click on that and put in any question you have, and we will come back at the end. We will have a presentation first of the elements of the actual report, and then we'll come back to the questions. So don't forget to put questions into the Q&A. You are, of course, perfectly free to use the chat function throughout as well, and we would recommend that you do that, and any observations or ideas or suggestions you might have that weren't exactly questions, feel totally free to put them in there as well. So without any more ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Charles Clarke to set us out on this launch of the Sustainable Progress Index for 2022. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sean, for the introduction and reminded me that the two groups that I've done the most for is Social Justice Ireland and the New York City Police Union. So one group can get me into trouble, but the other can get me out of trouble. So it works out that way. I'm glad to be here. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, just to give an overview of the whole report. My part is the first two. I'm going to look at the overall question of well-being and how it has entered into policy discussions and the different ranges of how you define well-being. Then we'll look at how it's measured. The two main approaches are the objective measures and the subjective. The Sustainable Development Goals are examples of objective measures. Then Catherine Kavanagh will present the Sustainable Progress Index, and then Colette will present the policy conclusions. Next slide. Okay, so my presentation is giving some background on the overall idea of well-being and how it is used in economics. For our purposes, we're going to look at well-being and happiness as if they're interchangeable terms. That's because they usually are interchangeable the way they're used. Psychologists would define them differently, but the economists aren't as exact as that. Next slide. And so if we look at the overall issue, we see that the idea of well-being has been a concern, not just recently, but it goes back to Aristotle. And in fact, the role of the state playing a role in promoting that also goes back to Aristotle. And for most economists, we look at, well, we can promote well-being by increasing wealth, because wealth will give us more resources, which mean that individuals can buy more so they can achieve more happiness, or at least meet their needs better. And for the society as a whole, they can provide better healthcare, education, infrastructure if they have more resources. So the emphasis has all been on how do we create wealth, or more exactly, how do we get the economy to grow as measured by gross domestic product. But something that the philosophers and Adam Smith have also pointed out, and that yes, wealth is a necessary aspect for promoting well-being, but it's not sufficient. That is, up to a point, it doesn't have the effect, and often economic growth can be a barrier to well-being. Okay, next slide. So after World War II, governments took responsibility for promoting economic growth, and GDP became the main way that this was measured, and the main measure of success and target. And then we started to get some criticisms because, well, first, GDP leaves out many important things. It doesn't measure home production, such as childcare, so it ignores a lot of what is important contributions to society, but they're not counted. Also, a lot of negative things lead to market transactions, so they increase GDP, but they're not necessarily increasing well-being, such as pollution, crime, illness. So for the past 30, 40 years, people have pointed out that GDP either is misleading or it is distorting, to a certain extent, how a country is doing. Ireland has its own special problems, which most recently go to the problem of foreign companies and how they book their profits and how this distorts Ireland's GDP. So if we look at the next slide, we see a table which shows just GDP per capita on the left where Ireland in our group of 14 countries comes in second, 62.6% above the overall average for those countries at 72,000 euros per capita, which is, it just isn't reasonable that Ireland is 62% richer than the average of all these countries. If we use instead final consumption as a measure, which is actually a better measure of how much people are actually buying, both as households and also as the government, you see that Ireland is more towards the middle and just a little over 1.8% above the average. On the right, we have a graph which shows the relationship between GDP per capita and final consumption. We see all but two of the countries are right on top of the trend line. So, and the R square is 0.9677, which is phenomenally high for economics. And we see Ireland and Luxembourg just way off of that. So clearly something else is going on. So if we needed more evidence of not relying on GDP to measure how Ireland is doing, this adds to that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as I said, there's been a long tradition now of arguing to go beyond GDP. Some of the early efforts are the Human Development Index, which was developed by the United Nations Development Program, and it starts with GDP, but it adds education and healthcare, or education statistics and a healthcare or a health statistic, longevity, a life expectancy, with the idea of trying to get more focus on them in terms of policy. All the attention in terms of development policy has been on GDP growth, and they wanted to focus on those two factors. It didn't have much of an impact in terms of changing the focus, but it led to a lot of other measures. And I'm just going to look at a couple, just to mention a couple. One, the Genuine Progress Indicator was an early attempt to adjust GDP based on costs that are not included, particularly environmental costs. And so their analysis showed that in terms of the United States, a lot of what is measured as economic growth is really because of social and environmental decay, and that the actual progress since the late 70s has been rather flat, which is how people feel. But if you look at GDP statistics, it looks like, well, the country has kept on growing. So this is an early attempt, and this is being pursued at the United Nations. Next week starts the Statistical Commission, and we'll have some discussion on green accounting and how to get environmental statistics into the national income accounting systems. Catherine and I did an index of social progress for Ireland in 1996 based on the index of social health in the United States to just show that to give an example of what could be done outside of just relying on GDP. The real change comes with the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report, which just really adds the support of two Nobel Prizes. Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen are they are definitely the two most important economists of their generation. And their report led a lot of weight to the idea that we have to go beyond just looking at production as our measure and looking at well-being. And they provide a list of the factors that should be included in well-being. And if we look at many of the reports that come after that, many of the indices and well-being statistics that come after it, they're greatly influenced by this report. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now the report points out, and Sen is a great philosopher as well, so we're not surprised. The report points out the importance of the philosophical underpinnings of how you measure well-being, because measuring well-being isn't something that is an objective fact that is just outside of value judgments. You have to start first with how you define what is a human and what would be human flourishing. And so the report goes over 3 basic approaches. I'm going to go in reverse order, and they give very little attention to this, but the fair allocation method is really what economists do and did before these new developments in measuring well-being. And that's fair allocation is really just welfare economics, which in my micro principles class we did this week. So it's standard economics, and it looks at how you can compare 2 positions based on using the willingness to pay criteria. Now, when you're looking at market transactions and you have competitive markets, well, then you can get very useful results. But the economists have been trying to apply this to non-market phenomena, which has all sorts of problems. And by using the willingness to pay method, it distorts really what are the values or the happiness for rich people, because that has so many, they have so many more market voices that they spend more money in the economy than everyone else, and so it distorts their preferences over society as a whole. But the 2 new developments have been based on the capabilities approach, which comes from Sen's work. And if you're interested in this, the best book to read is Development as Freedom. But it looks at the capabilities approach, looks at what are the capabilities you need in order to make decisions in your life to pursue the life that you think is meaningful. And so, but it looks at sort of the objective conditions, such as employment, and income would be part of that, but it would be a lot of other factors. And Sen's work really laid the foundation for the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. If you spend any time working at the United Nations, you see that Sen is sort of the philosopher of the United Nations, and he has greatly influenced their agencies and the work they do. More recently has been the subjective well-being approach, which is based on the science of happiness, which comes from psychology and other disciplines. It's also based on behavioral economics. In fact, behavioral economics is the application of the welfare economics that we talked before, but taking a different view of how humans make decisions, realizing that humans don't have perfect foresight, and so they are influenced by various other factors, and that we don't expect perfect rationality in decision making. And so behavioral economics has had a big impact here. Now, whereas the capabilities approach is really looking at, do you have the capabilities or the foundation in order to, like access to education, things like that, access to healthcare. The subjective well-being looked at outcomes. And so some of the work is looking at actual outcomes, so they use objective measures, but a lot of the work is moving more and more towards these surveys. And probably the biggest one is the Gallup survey, which just measures all across the world, has these lengthy surveys to determine happiness levels in each country. And the basic idea here is to look at how changes in the economy impact the level of happiness. Okay, so next slide. So here we have an example of some of the objective measures. GDP on the left. This is the Social Progress Index, which is put together by Michael Porter, the management professor. Then the Sustainable Development Goal Index, which is put together by Jeffrey Sachs. And then the one I want to just talk a little bit about, the World Happiness Index. The World Happiness Index looks at 5 or 6 objective measures, but then they also add these surveys, and they come up with a life satisfaction score. And this is the average. Ireland is 7.035, so they have a mixture, but there are ones that look just at survey scores of how people feel about their life and different aspects of their lives, and the Gallup poll being the biggest one. I wasn't able to figure out how I can get to reproduce the Gallup results without copyright infringement, so I wasn't able to include it. Next slide. But what's really interesting is the results of the subjective well-being research. I mean, there are hundreds of studies which look at how change in the rate of unemployment affects these survey results. The loss of a job, inflation, getting a job, getting a raise, all sorts of changes in your life, getting married, getting divorced, and how that affects your different happiness scores. The two I want to mention are the first two that we have here, and that's health. The health statistics, the health variables, particularly mental health. The results show that considerable a positive effect by addressing mental health. And this has led to some countries dramatically increasing their funding of mental health because they've been able to show what positive impact it has. On the finance side, the results show that increase in income increases well-being, particularly if you're in poverty. It's a lasting effect. But if you're out of poverty, if you have a middle class or better standard of living, the increase in income has a short-term effect. You feel better for a while, but then you go back to where you were before. Next slide. Okay, and so there are all sorts of problems that you have to be aware of with subjective well-being, particularly when you're measuring people's reporting of their feelings and how they feel about their situation. And then you compare countries, because there could be great cultural differences. But one of the things that we find is over time, with many different other variables, we see little impact on the average level of happiness. Japan is an example in there. They have the research on Japan and their level of happiness going back, very far when Japan was still poor. And now, of course, Japan is very rich, and the level of happiness hasn't really changed all that much. Okay, next slide. Okay, now the OECD has taken the lead in developing these well-being platforms, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then get to Ireland's one. But the current version has this sort of three-framework approach. One is the here and now, which looks at those factors that are in the Sen and Stiglitz report on income, wealth, etc. And then you have, but then they look at inequalities between and within groups, so that you're not just reporting what is the average, but you look at gender differences, and you look at how income inequality affects results. And then the third is focusing on future well-being, what they're calling the four capitals. They're looking at economic capital, natural capital, human capital, and social capital. But if you go to this website that we have a picture of here, they encourage you to change what you think are important, the weights, and then you see how that affects the results. Okay, next slide. So Ireland has used this, and lots of countries have used the OECD in its well-being information hub. And unlike the OECD, which is looking at comparing countries, Ireland is mostly focused on comparing Ireland to how Ireland has done in the past. Most of their factors are on the here and now list. They have some different variables. They have in the CSO, they have housing construction, which wouldn't normally be there, but it's a big issue in Ireland. So obviously they're adding it for that. There's some analysis of inequality, particularly good on gender and household type, but I couldn't find much in the way of income inequality. And we'll see an example how that could be important. And there's some on the four capitals, particularly natural and human capital, but it's not as much on social capital. Next slide. So here we see from the OECD results why inequality can be very important. So on the left, we have the life satisfaction score, how it's the difference between a person who's at the 80th percentile, it means they make more than 80% of the country, with someone who's in the 20th percentile. So the average for the Euro 14 that we're looking at is 2.1. So on average, the 80th percentile is 2.1 times happier, or is a higher life satisfaction score than the 20th percentile. In Ireland, it's 2.3, and we see Finland has the lowest at 1.5. On the right, we see attitudes towards the healthcare, and it gives a range of those at the top and those at the bottom, the 80th and 20th percentile for the income category. We see Ireland's doing very good in terms of adults reporting of the healthcare, both at the bottom and at the top. But I think it's useful to give that range. Next slide. And then in terms of the measures of economic, measures of the future capital, here we have just two examples. There are many examples under all four categories in the OECD report, but I picked out these two. One because, one is obviously very worrying, or could be very worrying, and that's the financial net worth of total economy. We see Ireland is really an outlier here. Now, this could be because of all the debt from the financial crisis, but it also could be part of the whole mess up that happens to national statistics accounting because of all the foreign companies and how they book their profits. But that's certainly be worth looking into, because clearly you don't want to have a country that is that in debt, because that will involve future transfers to whoever they're indebted to. And then on the right, we have a measurement of government stakeholder engagement, comparing 2014 with 2018. And here we have Ireland, the second country and the lowest in terms. And this measures how engaged citizens can be in the creation of laws and regulations. And the idea of the more engaged, the more well-being, because there is evidence that the more engaged the population is in the political system, the higher the levels of happiness. Next slide. Okay, so the purpose of what we do is to just try to give as much evidence and a wide range of evidence to help policymakers and citizens evaluate the current situation and benchmark it against countries that are similar. So if your country has a low statistic in one area, you could look at what are the countries that are doing well in that area. What do they do that could be duplicated in Ireland? Well-being frameworks usually provide a wider range of factors than just looking at GDP. They can allow for historical and social context, which is often missing in economic variables. But that's very good. Subjective well-being measures can be, I think, taken to the extreme. That is, instead of just looking at how people feel about an outcome, they look at how positive thinking can change how they feel about the outcome. So if you lose your job, obviously you're going to feel less happy, and the solution should be a better labor market, not, well, let's make you feel less happy about the fact that you've lost your job. I think the advantages of the objective measures like the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are widely accepted and they've become part of official data collection, and they don't have as many of the problems that the subjective measures can have. But again, the purpose is to learn from other countries' experience. This is the Olympic seasons now. This is not the Olympics of social, economic, environmental statistics. We're not looking at bragging rights. What we're looking at is how we can learn from other people's experience. This very business education approach but I think it's very useful in terms of understanding public policy. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. So hi, I'm going to take you through the latest version of our Sustainable Index. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of the data and then talk a little bit about how we constructed the index. And then I'm going to take you through the rankings by the 14 countries. Now, first I'm going to take you through how Ireland has performed on the spheres of the economy, society and environment. And then we'll look at the overall aggregate index itself. And of course, I will refer you to the actual report where all the information about the data and the method are more fully explained. So next slide. I suppose you all know, obviously, that the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development way back in 2015. And it identified the 17 SDGs based on 169 targets with over 230 indicators. And of course, the SDGs then came into force in 2016. So Eurostat, of course, the World Health Organization, the UN, the CSO and the OECD, they've all committed to monitoring the SDGs and collecting data that is required by countries to ensure that they do try to achieve progress with the SDGs. And also, I suppose, since 2016, several researchers and organizations and even the UN themselves have been attempting to report on them. And as Sean mentioned earlier, Social Justice Ireland, through the work of myself and Charlie, have been tracking Ireland's progress on the SDGs since around that time as well. So next slide, so please, yeah. So the first thing that we did in this report was to look at the latest Eurostat report. Now, Eurostat produce now a regular report, an annual report, and this is actually quite informative because what they try to do is track 5-year trends in the key indicators of the SDGs. Now, they don't actually produce an index in itself, but their report really is valuable because they attempt to track how the EU are performing on the main indicators. And then they arrive at a conclusion about how they believe each of the EU's 27 countries have been performing on the goals. So they use about 100 indicators in total, and about 36 of these are classified as what they call multi-purpose indicators, which means that they appear under a number of different SDGs. Now, this latest report says that there has been improvement in the achievement of the goals, but that this has occurred at different paces for each SDG, which they regard as being from moderate to significant. And the graphic here on the right shows, I suppose, at a glance, where significant progress has been made, and that's up there on the right-hand corner of your screen. So right up at the very top of the arrow where you see SDG 16 and SDG 1. Ranging from there down to the very end, at the very bottom of the screen, where you're looking at much, much weaker progress. So I suppose it's important to emphasize as well that, you know, Eurostat have very clearly said that the pandemic has made achieving the 2030 agenda and the SDGs ever more challenging. And this is just not within the EU, this is obviously on a global scale. Nevertheless, they say that strong progress has been made towards fostering peace, personal security, access to justice, that's our SDG 16, and good progress has also been made on certain aspects of poverty, which is SDG 1, and also in improving EU's health situation. The assessment of the other goals really, I suppose, falls somewhere in the middle. And so these would be the goals capturing inequality, education and global partnership. And 2 goals, SDG 7, which is all about affordable and clean energy, and also SDG 15, which is life on land, show a slight movement away from the objectives of sustainable development over the last 5 years. Now, it's, I suppose, important to emphasize also that Eurostat make it quite clear that just because countries are making progress towards the goals doesn't mean that the target in itself will be actually achieved. Okay, so next slide, please. And then there's, of course, another body of work which is produced by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Institute. Now, their work over the last numerous years has complemented the work of Eurostat, and their latest report provides a lot of information and country profiles on 165 countries, including many of the less developed countries. They actually do calculate an index, and each country is then ranked by how far away from achieving each SDG is. Countries, they produce what are called country-specific dashboards from the data, and that provides guidelines really to policymakers on areas that would be specifically challenging. Now, this graphic shows their most recent dashboard for Ireland. Let me just explain what the colours mean. The colours, I suppose, indicate progress being made under each SDG. Now, a green indicator implies achievement on all indicators, on that goal, sorry, but all indicators under the green one must be green in order for the SDG to get a ranking of green. And then, of course, yellow, orange and red indicate increasing distance from SDG achievement. So as I say, this is Ireland's latest dashboard, and what they conclude from their analysis is that Ireland faces major challenges, particularly on goals 2, 12, 13 and 17, as you can see here in the graphic. And 4 other goals then are regarded as being significant challenges, and those are the ones that are color coded in orange. Okay, so next slide. So I suppose we'll move on now to what we did with our report. I suppose the first thing to mention is that our focus this time around is, as Sean said, on the EU 14. We're measuring performance of each country relative to other countries, and particularly those countries that we consider to be Ireland's peers, countries really with a similar level of development. The second thing to mention is, I suppose, that there's a quite extensive data set collected for the analysis. Now, we begin our data selection with the official UN indicator set produced in 2017, and of course that's obviously revisited and updated regularly, the most recent one being 2020. And we also draw on the EU SDG indicator set, and the most recent one there is 2021. That's important because the EU data set includes indicators that are most relevant to the EU policies and initiatives. So we try to ensure as far as possible that the final data set is as closely aligned with the global indicators, but also takes account of the EU context. Now, another of additional, I suppose, rules help to guide our data selection. So we take a look at those now on the next slide, please. Thanks, Clarke. So I suppose the first thing to note is that we have these 4 different criteria, the first being relevance and applicability. Now, in our data set, we say that the data must be directly related, similar or relevant to the monitoring of the SDG. So indicators that are not directly relevant to the EU 14 countries are excluded. So for example, the UN collects data on things like stunting and wasting and undernourishment. So we exclude those because we're looking at more developed countries, clearly. Other indicators then that maybe not official indicators are included because they capture the theme of a particular SDG. Second is relation to quality. We use only official published data from international sources such as Eurostat, the OECD, the World Health Organization, the UN, and so on. But we also draw on some non-governmental organizations such as Gallup and Transparency International. And this is to ensure, I suppose, that we have the best, most reliable data to capture each SDG. As far as coverage is concerned, data must be available for all of the 14 countries in our data set. And if any indicators have missing data for countries, we don't use them. Finally, I suppose, and importantly, we try to, as far as possible, use the most recent data available. And for most countries and for most data and for most of our indicators, that is 2020. So as a result of the foregoing sort of guidelines, we arrive at 87 indicators across the 17 goals to arrive at our final data set. However, I think it's important to emphasize that due to lags in data collection and data generation, the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs cannot be fully captured in our index here, despite we know the containment measures that have been widely introduced by a lot of EU member states during the period. So we really do believe that the full scale of the pandemic will likely only be revealed in later editions. And a final comment also to make is that for most SDGs, we have a minimum of 4 indicators, but there is some unequal coverage. And again, that is specifically down to data availability. So for example, in 2 instances at least, we've only, for SDG 13, we've only 2 indicators, and for SDG 11, we've only got 3 indicators. Now, this is far from ideal, we recognize that, but for a lot of the other goals, the data that's available is a lot more far wide ranging. Okay, so we'll move on then to the next slide, which looks at our method. So just very quickly then, we draw on a method that is similar to that has then been used by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues in 2016. And the first step in constructing the index is to rescale the data, because clearly there's a lot of different data from a lot of different sources, and we need to make it comparable across all indicators. So all indicators are expressed in ascending order, so that a better performance on an indicator also implies a higher SDG value. And the benefit of this approach is that it allows us to benchmark Ireland against the other countries at indicator level, at SDG level, and also then at the aggregate index level, the Sustainable Progress Index level. Now, as in previous years, each weight that's assigned to the equal weight is assigned to all of the goals in the index. And this is really, I suppose, emphasized by the UN, who say that all of the goals are integrated and deliverable and indivisible, and they balance the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. So I think that's important to emphasize. And as I say, once we've aggregated then across all 17 goals, we arrive at our sustainable index. Okay, next slide. So here, what I'm going to do is take you through some of the findings of our economy index. Now, this index is constructed by merging or combining 2 goals, SDG 8 and SDG 9. So I'm going to just very briefly, I suppose, explain some of the kind of key trends in both of those goals. So SDG 8, as you know, relates to decent work and economic growth. And we calculated here drawing on 6 indicators. And for this goal, Ireland's GDP per capita is obviously high. It's second only to Luxembourg. And, even despite the pandemic, there's been a significant improvement in economic growth, and Ireland is actually ranked highest, the first of the 14 on economic growth. Our SDG 8 also includes other indicators such as the employment rate, the NEAT rate. Now we struggle a little bit on the NEAT rate, which is the youths not in employment, education and training. And we also include accidents at work in an attempt to capture the whole idea of decent work and average wages. So the overall score on SDG in our most recent report is 6th. So it's ranked 6th on SDG 8. And then moving on to SDG 9, which relates to industry, innovation and infrastructure. I suppose the aim of this goal is to promote increased access to financial services and information and communication technologies. And it also recognizes the importance of research and innovation for achieving the goals. So indicators that we use for SDG 9 include things such as the R&D, the extent of R&D expenditure, the amount of patents, the amount of internet use, and there's a logistics indicator in there as well. So 5 indicators are used for SDG 9, and the overall ranking on that goal is 12. So when we combine SDG 8 and SDG 9, I suppose the table here shows that our economy index gives us a ranking of 9 of the 14 different countries. Okay, so next we'll move on to the, just to actually, I suppose, maybe just briefly look at 2 key indicators. I thought these were interesting and important to maybe emphasize. On the left-hand panel, you'll see obviously Ireland's GDP, which is the green trend relative to the EU 27 average. And on the right-hand panel, this is one of the indicators that we'll look at in a moment, which is the area under organic farming for SDG 2. And I suppose the important conclusion here is that Ireland's extent of organic farming is very low, which drives a lot of the kind of conclusions we see for SDG 2. So moving on then, as I say, to our society index in the next slide. So we use 8 SDGs to combine the society to reflect our society index. The first one there is no poverty, which seeks for an end to poverty in all its manifestations. Now we draw on 4 different indicators to construct that goal, and Ireland is ranked 11th on SDG 1. I mentioned SDG 2 there earlier because SDG 2 relates to no hunger. And I suppose it's a bit broader than that though, however, because as we know, food security, the eradication of hunger, improved nutrition, sustainable agriculture, all of those are the main concerns of SDG 2. Now, there are no major issues about food security within the EU currently, in terms of certainly just sufficiency and supply. So hence, in the EU, achieving healthy diets and ensuring agricultural systems remain productive and sustainable, they're the key challenges associated with Goal 2. As far as the results are concerned, the EU's nutrition-related health issue is obesity, and it affects about 15% of the adult population in the EU in 2017. Ireland's obesity rate is also of a concern, and indeed it's actually highest within our sample of the 14 countries, with over 25% of the population categorized as obese. We get a ranking of 12 on SDG 2. Good health and well-being is what SDG 3 is attempting to focus in on. And so it looks at ensuring the health and well-being for all ages by improving reproductive, maternal and child health. It also focuses on behavioural and environmental health risks. So in addition to indicators like life expectancy, there are subjective well-being measures in there. And there are indicators on things such as death due to chronic diseases. We also have measures in there of alcohol and smoking. So a lot more, I suppose, wide range of availability of data for that, for the calculation of that SDG. And Ireland scores in the middle of the ranking for SDG 3 at, it's ranked sixth out of the 14 countries, and Netherlands, Sweden and Luxembourg score highest on that SDG. We come then to SDG 4, which is all about quality education, and it deals with access to equitable and quality education through all stages of life. And of course, you know, I suppose it's important to emphasize that education is key to meeting all other SDGs. Well, certainly the ones such as reducing poverty, inequality, gender equality, because we know, of course, it also contributes to growth, employment, productivity, innovation, competitive and healthy lifestyles, and so on. Now, this is one of the SDGs that Ireland scores particularly well in. In fact, Ireland's performance on SDG 4 is impressive. We're ranked first of the 14 countries for quality education. Okay, now let's move on to SDG 5, which relates to gender equality. Now, again, this slide here, I suppose, just captures just very quickly then where we see Ireland's educational goals scoring so highly, the percentage of territory, the percentage of the population with tertiary education far exceeds, as you can see here on the left-hand panel, the EU average. And also we do very well on the indicator capturing early leavers from education, where our levels are much, much lower than some of the other countries in the EU, and certainly much lower than the EU average. So let's move on then to SDG 5. So SDG 5 is all about, as I say, gender equality. Yeah, if you just go back, yeah, for the moment, yeah, just stay there for a moment, Colette, thank you. So just gender equality is the aim, as I say, of SDG 5, and it focuses ending all forms of discrimination, violence and harmful practices against women, and recognising the need for equal rights and opportunities for female leadership at all political and economic decision-making levels. 5 indicators are used to capture SDG 5. And performance is kind of mixed on this goal. We score quite low on indicators for both the share of women in national parliament and also in senior management roles. They are actually showing Ireland to be well below the EU average. And as you can see there on the left-hand panel in this slide, you see the seats held by women in national parliament. And as I said, Ireland is below the EU average on that particular indicator. On a positive note, the gender gap is actually reversed in the area of education, meaning that women are ahead of men, and Ireland is actually ranked first of the 14 countries on that indicator, which is the female education as a percentage of male education. Obviously, reducing the gender pay gap is also one of the key priorities of gender policy at both EU and national levels. And at EU level, the gender pay gap has decreased slightly over the years, and Ireland is actually below the EU 27 countries at about 11.3%. The EU average is about 14%. So the overall score for Sdg 5 puts it in 10th place overall, and Sweden, Finland and Denmark score the highest on that goal. Let's turn to Sdg 10 now, which again is about reduced inequalities. It's concerned with inequality relating to income, sex, ages, disability, race, class, ethnicity, and religion, and so on. A key focus is also on increasing the income of the bottom 40% of the population by adopting relevant policies and legislation. We use 4 indicators to capture the theme of inequality. And generally it's sort of a mixed performance is what we're seeing, with Ireland scoring in the middle of the ranking. Overall, our selected indicators for SDG put it at 7th place amongst our 14 countries. SDG 16 is all about peace, justice and strong institutions. There's a wider range of indicators again available for this SDG. And, the scores show that Ireland is a relatively safe society with a much lower number of deaths associated with homicide and assault, a lower perceived occurrence of crime, violence and vandalism. This is all relative to the countries in our sample. And Ireland performs relatively well on this goal also. Its scoring puts it in 6th place. And the final, I suppose, goal under our society index is the Sdg 17, which relates to partnership for the goals. Now, we believe this is an important SDG because the SDGs can really only be realized with a strong commitment to global partnership and cooperation. I suppose that really is the basis for the SDGs, which focuses on the global macroeconomy. Our SDG draws on 4 indicators. A key one is the extent of official development assistance as a percentage of gross national income. Now, Ireland's rate for 2020 was 0.31%, which is well below the EU average, as you can see here on the right-hand panel of your slide. And Ireland is actually ranked in 9th place, therefore, on that indicator. Now, as a member of the EU, Ireland is clearly, therefore, a long way off meeting its commitment on that goal. Other indicators we include, for example, an indicator of the general government deficit, because that's important at EU level. And at 58.4% of GDP in 2020, Ireland's debt was again below the EU 2017 country average. So another indicator that's used there is the extent of environmental taxes as a proportion of revenue. And again, that's one of the key Eurostat statistics for this goal. And Ireland is kind of on a par with the European countries for that indicator. So overall, Ireland is ranked 9th out of the 15 countries for the society, for goal number 17. So the combined score for our society index, next slide please, puts Ireland in 9th place for the society variables. So 9th place, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, the society index is in 8th place, I beg your pardon, it isn't 9th, it's 8th place. Okay, so that's the society index. So we move on now to the environmental index. So here we have the environmental index, and we combine 7 SDGs to capture the environmental dimension. So I'm going to just take you through very quickly then the sort of scores on the individual SDGs. So SDG 6 is all about ensuring the availability and cleanliness of water and the management of sustainable water. Now, obviously, water is a basic need. So this goal calls for universal access to safe and affordable drinking water. Now, we arrive at 4 indicators to arrive at our measure of SDG. There's significant room for improvement. Now, there are obviously pluses and minuses. Some problems with data availability and comparability across countries in this SDG, but we use what we have, and the results show, as I say, some sort of a mixed bag, really. Eurostat's Water Exploitation Index, Ireland scores relatively well on that. That's a kind of a measure of the total fresh water use as a percentage of the renewable fresh water. And Ireland scores about 6th on that indicator, but not so well on the other indicators. So Ireland is ranked in 10th place for SDG 6. SDG 7 then is about affordable and clean energy. 4 indicators used to capture this SDG. Now, Ireland's CO2 emissions from energy fuels are one of the highest in the sample, and the share of the renewable energy is actually one of the lowest in the sample. And this is, of course, bearing in mind that there are some positives. So, for example, the final energy consumption in households per capita has certainly fallen since 2000, and it's actually now below the EU average. However, when we combine all our different indicators to capture SDG 7, we find Ireland is ranked in 11th place on that goal. SDG 11 then looks at sustainable cities and communities. And we do quite well, Ireland does quite well on this goal, which includes a measure of air pollution and satisfaction with transport and so on. And the overall score for quality in life in our cities puts Ireland in 4th place of the EU 14. SDG 12, I suppose it's fair to say that economic growth has long been linked to an increase in resource and energy consumption. But the main aim of SDG 12 is about doing more and better with less. So we use 6 indicators to capture the theme of this goal. And again, Ireland performs actually, I think, poorly on this goal relative to the other countries, at least. Production of municipal waste is one of the highest of the countries in our sample. Recycling rate of municipal waste is one of the lowest. The indicator for circular material use is also one of the lowest of the countries here. And however, on the plus side, the score for resource productivity and CO2 emissions from new passenger cars puts it in the middle of the ranking. Overall, however, our score on SDG gives Ireland a ranking of 11. So it really does, I suppose, indicate there's still extensive challenges for that goal. Goal number 13 relates to climate change. It concerns the integration of climate change mitigation and measures into strategies and policies to reduce the severity, I suppose, from the effects of climate-related hazards and disasters. Now, there are problems with data availability. So, for example, reliable and comprehensive measures of mitigation and impacts and initiative. It makes this goal one of the SDGs that international agencies still find problematic when attempting to determine important trends specifically. We are, I suppose, resigned to using 2 indicators. The first is greenhouse gases, because this is one of the key indicators used by Eurostat. And we also use a measure of the effective carbon rate, which is also known as the carbon pricing score. Ireland's GHG emissions are still above the EU average, and the carbon pricing indicator is somewhere in the middle of the ranking. So the overall score for SDG 13 comes in with a ranking of 10. 2 more to go. SDG 14. The aim of SDG 14, as we know, is to conserve and sustain the use of oceans, seas, and marine resources, and so on. Again, SDG 14 is one of those goals that difficulty with trend analysis is quite evident. Country-specific data is still an issue for accurately estimating achievement. However, you know, we draw on what is available, including new enough indicators that attempt to measure, attempt is the right word, I think, sustainable fishery and healthy oceans. And Ireland's overall score on that measure is 4th. Okay, so then SDG 15, again, along with, I suppose, SDG 14, it's one of the goals that incorporates environmental considerations for all the UN member countries, and it seeks to protect, restore and promote conservation and sustainability of our ecosystems. We settle on 5 indicators to capture SDG 15. And again, you know, the share of protected terrestrial areas and freshwater areas put Ireland sort of close to the top of the ranking on that goal. The score on the red list index is less favourable. That measure tries to capture biodiversity loss. And the share of land dedicated, I suppose, for forestry is also very low relative to the EU average. So the overall rank on SDG 15 is 8. So combining all of our SDGs to capture the environmental dimension, as we can see in our table here, gives Ireland a ranking of 9 for the environment. So really, I suppose it really does point to the significant challenges in meeting our commitment to the environmental goals as set out in Agenda 2030. Now, if we move to the next slide, I suppose that these are just some of the key indicators I thought it might be well, you know, worthwhile showing you. On the left-hand side, we have the share of renewable energy, and Ireland, as you can see, is well below the EU average on that measure. And on the right-hand side, we have the greenhouse gas emissions, and again, Ireland's emissions are significantly higher than the EU average again. Next slide. Okay, so this really, I suppose, is just a graphic that just tries to bring all the other information together in one slide. So what we have is the 3 dimensions: economy, society, environment. The economy is ranking at 9 of the 14 countries, society is ranked 8th, and the environment is ranked 9th. Okay, so those are the 3 different dimensions. However, I think it's important that we take a look at how Ireland is doing overall. So if we move to the next slide now, we can see where we stand overall. So I suppose this is our sustainable index, sustainable progress index for 2022. And the benefit of this measure is it presents in a single index how the EU 14 countries score and rank on average of all of the 17 goals. Okay, so it really does, I suppose, in one measure, draw our attention to potential problems or issues that need to be tracked. And I suppose the other thing is it provides, I think, a useful measure to track Ireland's performance compared to our EU peers. And these are our EU peers, countries that have experienced similar level developments over the last numerous years. So combining all our 17 goals in our Sustainable Progress Index gives Ireland a ranking of 10th. So we rank 10th out of the 14 countries overall. The Scandinavian countries, as you can see there, well, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands and Finland all come out, as they have in previous examples of our reports, you know, come out again ranking at the top, and Spain and Greece ranking at the bottom. Okay, enough, I suppose, of all the numbers stuff now, and let's see, I suppose, what all of this really means on the ground. So I'm going to pass you over to Colette now, so she'll be able to talk you through, I suppose, the major policy implications arising from our study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a phenomenal presentation. Such a huge amount of information covered in such a very short space of time. So for those of you who have yet to download the document, it is available on our website. I know my colleague Suzanne put it into the chat, so do go through it at your leisure, because there's certainly a huge amount of information there. So what I'm going to be covering is, as Catherine has said, the conclusions and the policy recommendations that we would make for Ireland, both locally and nationally. Now, again, there's a huge amount of information in this, so I'm going to kind of cherry pick some of them, but the full detail is contained in the document itself. As I'm sure everybody here is aware, the SDGs are a blueprint to achieve a much better, much more sustainable future for all. And this report really tries to contribute to the debate on the shape of Ireland, the shape of Europe and our world in 2030 and beyond. Our central goal here is to show how Ireland compares relative to the EU 14 as it is now peers. And we believe that knowing where we stand can help us to figure out how we need to go, where we need to get to. So moving on, we very much welcome the government's work in relation to a well-being framework, because this is really giving us the language, the tools to engage with policy that is driven by the needs of society rather than pure economic thought. In the past year, the government has worked to deliver this well-being framework to, as they say themselves, better measure Ireland's progress as a country and better align policy decisions with people's experiences. So aligning that framework with the SDGs would then also ensure policy coherence between our national targets and our international commitments. The first report on the Wellbeing Framework was published last July 2021. And what that did was it set out the amount of work that has been undertaken across all of the stakeholders. The responsibility for this piece of work rests with the Taoiseach's department. So it is a fully interdepartmental approach that is being taken. The overarching vision for that first report was to enable all our people to live fulfilled lives now and into the future. It is ingrained in well-being across person, place and society. And for people like us in Social Justice Ireland and many, many others, that is music to our ears. That is exactly what we want to hear. It's things that we have been calling for such a long time. Now, the vision had two elements. Firstly, to provide an overarching framework for policy making and to deliver that greater policy coherence across government departments. But secondly, then to improve the impact of policy on people's lives. So determining that second element, of course, will require the ability to measure that impact. So it said what is counted is what counts. And I've heard Catherine say that many a time. And so the indicators that are actually used to measure the impact of the wellbeing framework are going to be really critically important. In developing the dimensions, and there are 11 of them in the wellbeing framework, the department drew, as Charlie said, primarily on the OECD work in relation to their wellbeing framework and their existing 11 domains. The National Economic and Social Council, NESC, also established a subgroup of stakeholders and experts, of which we in Social Justice Ireland were part. So that subgroup then provided consultation supports throughout the development of the framework, with a focus very much on equality and inclusion. The NESC report then identified three overarching and interlinked priorities. So equity, agency, and sustainability, ensuring that all voices are heard, particularly those who may be furthest away from the policy space, but of course more likely to be impacted by policy changes. So Ireland's wellbeing framework consists of 11 dimensions: subjective wellbeing, mental and physical health, income and wealth, knowledge and skills, housing and local area, environment, climate and biodiversity, safety and security, work and job quality, time use, community, social connections and cultural participation, and civic and cultural expression. And this figure here is how the department, I suppose, set out where the interconnections between those 11 dimensions were. So focusing on, I suppose, the person, moving out to the place and out to society. But obviously there will be more interconnection than that. And this is our attempt at illustrating what that might look like. So this, we believe, is how many of the dimensions are connected in terms, and then how they are connected with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see there is a significant level of crossover there. So by using the framework for well-being, we can really move ourselves towards our commitments under the SDGs. So in looking at the policy proposals that we have in our index, and I'm going to very, very briefly do that, what we put together was just we ranked them under the well-being indicators, the 11 dimensions there, and we showed how these interconnections exist. Obviously, there will be more that can cross over, and there'll be other areas as well. This is just a kind of an attempt in the first instance. So if we look at subjective well-being as being the first one, you know, we know, and we have argued for a very long time, and in fact we published a very long document September in 2020, that we need a new social contract to underpin well-being for all. With a social contract that puts people and society at the centre, we can really have this this person-centred, this societal-based, equitable society, and a functioning economy that stems from that. Moving on then to mental and physical health, and there's a range of policy proposals in this piece, but just to highlight, I suppose, we need a focus on sustainable food production. Catherine mentioned that we have particular issues in relation to obesity. So we need to look at, in terms of food security, but also food quality, and how we can manage that within our own spaces. We also need to expand the Hot Schools Meals programme to ensure that those children who are most marginalised can access it and are getting the benefit from it. In terms of, again, in terms of mental health and physical health, we have been calling for a very long time in terms of community health networks, or primary care networks as they were formerly known. We would like to see the full funding of Sláinte care and proper resourcing of mental health services. What has been happening in Calves is absolutely unacceptable, and we are strongly advocating for greater supports in that area. Moving on then to number 3, income and wealth. We need an ambitious, among many other things, as you can see here, and you can see the SDG linkages. We've got no poverty, Sdg 1, we've got Sdg 4 in terms of quality education, and Catherine alluded to that earlier on as well, in terms of how that links into many others, and greater gender equality. So we need an ambitious anti-poverty target for Ireland. We need to benchmark core social welfare rates to 27.5% of average earnings, and we need to have a robust financial literacy strategy and introduce a state social welfare pension. Moving on then to knowledge and skills. Really, we must make combating educational disadvantage a priority. If we are truly to deliver educational equality, that is where we need to start. We need to invest our resources, we need to have our best people, we need to make sure that we are targeting at the right levels and the right families and the right areas to make sure that everybody has an equal start. In housing, and there are many things that we can say here, but you know, our main focus would be that government should set a target of 20% of all housing as social housing. We see that in European countries, which we would like to emulate. There is no reason why we can't move from our 8–9% as we are to a target of 20%. We are a very wealthy country, but we have over 112,000 households who are in need of sustainable long-term housing. You'll see there again that there are a huge amount of other recommendations in relation to this coming under Sdg 11 and under this well-being indicator that, you know, cover the whole spectrum between rural development, taxation and passive house construction. Moving on to the environment, climate and biodiversity. We need an aviation fuel tax to fund a just transition. We need a series of policy recommendations under SDGs 6, 7, 12, 13, 14 and 15. And we need a just transition and adaptation dialogue, because once we can generate the investment that is actually needed, the money that is needed, we then need to decide how best, how appropriately and how equitably to actually distribute those resources. Moving on then to safety and security, and the SDG we have here is SDG 10 in relation to reduced inequalities. We know from research, and anybody who's ever read the research by Wilson and Pickett will know, that the spirit level will know that more equal societies are safer societies, they're happier societies. So really we need to prioritise that. We need also to prioritise action on the UN Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that recommended an end to discrimination, and we need to tackle that. I'm sure there isn't a woman in the country that would also see gender equality as an SDG that could go under here as well, and many of the measures that need to be done there. In terms of work and job equality, we need to actively promote gender equality in all boards, all elections, all committees at local and national level. We need that legislation to support flexible and remote working introduced, properly debated in the Oireachtas, properly formulated, that puts workers, that puts society to the forefront, and we need that implemented soon as. Also in relation to Sdg 8 then, in terms of how we might engage with this, reintroducing the non-principal private resident tax in relation to quality, recognising that we need greater investment, upskilling those who are unemployed or at risk of unemployment, and increasing the minimum wage to a move towards the living wage. Moving on then to time use, and we've used SDGs 3, 8 and 17 here. And really, I just want to highlight, we need increased support for carers, including increased respite hours, but also things around increased job security, less 0 hours and precarious contracts, and implementing that strategy that was published a number of years ago for the community and voluntary sector, the Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Communities Strategy. Second last one, we need real social dialogue, and that will come as a surprise to literally no one who has engaged with Social Justice Ireland's work in the last number of years. But that dialogue needs to include all 5 pillars. We also need to improve our regulations and our regulatory system, particularly when it comes to things like housing and infrastructure. And then finally, and I apologise for the whistle stop tour, but I'm really conscious we want to get to your questions as well, to civic engagement and cultural expression. So, we have been advocating for a long time to move towards our ODA target, or the UN ODA target of 0.7% of national income. And to do that in as short a time frame as possible. We would also like to see proper commitment to our allocation on climate finance and our targets there. We also need to tag all government policies and policy proposals with the relevant goals and make sure that there is accountability in doing that, and to develop a national index of progress. So just coming back to this, quite frankly, bizarre graphic, there is, as I say, significant crossover across dimensions. And when it comes to implementing the SDGs, this can be a real support in terms of where government is already going towards a wellbeing framework for policy. Proper implementation of that framework could really help bring Ireland closer to our goals. And aligning the wellbeing framework with the SDGs, the interconnectedness and the need for policy coherence here is again, obviously very apparent. So with that, I will hand you back to Sean for the Q&A. Thank you so much. You're mute, Sean.
Not for the first time, but anyway, it doesn't happen too often. Thanks for that. Listen, I was just saying it was a whistle stop tour in real time. There's so much in the actual report that I think we have to just acknowledge that we can only cover so much in a presentation, in a series of presentations like this. So I think we need to see Catherine Kavanagh and Charles Clarke here as well. I want to thank both of them, and Colette as well, for the tremendous presentation that brought us through a very comprehensive report, and did it with such clarity and doing it in such a short time. There's a lot of people on the call, and they're on this who have been listening, and there's quite a lot of questions lined up as well. So we'll start with those. Just to say to people that the actual report is on our website. You can download it now, and likewise the presentation and so on will be there as well now in due course. So let's go, if we start with the questions right away, and there's no, I don't think there's any kind of particular order here now, but let's start with one from Nessun Vaughan, Does Professor Clarke believe that more equal societies, and where income distribution is concerned, tend to be happier and have higher levels of well-being, as many studies suggest? Charlie?
Yeah, the research is fairly strong that overall, more equal societies are happier in various ways that you measure, or have higher well-being. But it's also for many of the factors, so that we know that in terms of income levels and its effect, the relative effect is what is most important. So when you have more inequality and then you have growth, it doesn't lead to more happiness, because it's just raising the gap between people. So the people who are higher will go up, but the people who, even if their income goes up, because the distance from the top also increases, then their level of happiness goes down. And of course, there are fewer people who go up when income equality goes up, and lots who lag behind. So it has a negative effect, but it also has the effect that it means that your other resources will then be unequal. Your access to healthcare will be unequal. You know, all the other things that money get will be unequal, and they have big effect on well-being and happiness.
Good stuff. Good. A question from Jean Boucher, saying nice presentation. A question: can you say something about the emissions intensity of well-being?
Yes, that's an area which they've been finding a good deal of research, particularly on air quality and its effect on well-being. And this probably works through the health effects. And we know that health has a big impact on well-being. But there's also evidence that it doesn't look like it's as strong now, or that just isn't as much volume in terms of water quality, also having an impact on well-being. And probably through the same effect in terms of the health effects.
Catherine, do you want to say anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to say air quality is actually included in under Sdg 11. So we include it as a measure to capture. I mean, it's for the Sdgs, it comes in under you know, the quality of our cities and communities. So there's an indicator in there for it tries to capture it. Yeah.
A question, I think, for Colette. What is Ireland's legal obligation, if any, to advance the SDGs? There is little evidence that county and city development plans are being framed around the achievements of the SDGs. I should say, by the way, that question is from Brendan Mulligan.
Yeah, thank you. The SDGs aren't legally binding, so every country is expected to implement them, and every country has targets towards them, but they aren't legally enforceable. Now, obviously, there is legislation and separate pieces of legislation that will feed in towards progress to the goals. We have our Equality Acts, for example. We have our minimum wage legislation. We have our housing legislation. We have the new Climate Act. But collectively, for all 17, there isn't any piece of legislation to implement them.
Good. So that shows, I think, something maybe that needs to be looked at in terms, particularly if we're going to make well-being a kind of a core focus of government policy and so on. That's what government says in its own programme for governance, so we'll see.
I can see the cogs of Sean Healy's mind working now for the next Social Justice Ireland programme of work, so thank you for that, Brendan.
No problem at all. Have to keep them on the move. To Catherine, this was from an anonymous person. While stunting and wastage not included as indicators for Ireland, are health outcomes of developed countries such as obesity and diabetes included?
Yes, obesity comes under Sdg 2, and the stunting and wasting isn't actually included in our Sdg, because at the level of the developed countries of the EU, it's suggested that they're just not relevant. I mean, because all countries do superbly well on all of them, and on all of those indicators at the EU level. So we don't include it, but certainly obesity is in there. Obesity comes under Sdg, which is malnutrition, as I say, and health issues. the impact of diabetes. It doesn't specifically go in there, but it's, I mean, there's measures in the health Sdg 3, which try to capture, you know, all the various different aspects of health, including, for example, deaths due to chronic diseases and so on and so forth. But no, obesity is in there, as I say, and other measures of such as cancer and all those kind of things are in there as well under Sdg 3.
Thanks, Amelia and Catherine. That's great. The question, I think, for Charles, it comes from Caroline White. Given the serious issues that Charles mentioned, both specific to Ireland and global, with GDP growth as an indicator, why is GDP still being used in the report, and have alternative measures of economic activity being considered?
Well, the main reason why we include it is because it is an official statistic which governments use and refer to. And, you know, we don't want to create our own statistics. We want to use official statistics. But that is a good question. Why do the governments keep on relying on it so much when this, you know, very widespread agreement as to the problems? Right now, you know, next week, the Statistical Commission is meeting, and they're working on the update of the national systems of accounting, which is what governments use for GDP and other national income statistics. And in '92, there was a short paragraph on the problems with GDP. In the 2008, there was a whole page, but I expect there's going to be a whole chapter this time. As it comes up over and over again whenever this issue is discussed. And the real pressure in the UN system is on the environmental side. And because so many things that increase GDP are just using up your resources and polluting the environment, and then not counting that you've polluted your environment and that you've used up your resources, which if the country was a business, you would include that. There's assets and debits and all that sort of stuff. And so that is the push, is to try to make GDP more useful by adding in the costs, the environmental costs. And that's where the energy is. And then, you know, people bring up, well, we have to look at the social cost as well. And that gets some attention, but the main attention is on some sort of green GDP.
Stuff. That's good. We'll keep motoring. There's several questions still. From Caroline Crowley, are any measures of childcare supports included in assessing improvement in gender equality?
The answer, no. Our measures we don't have those kind of statistics. They're not available at for the Eurostat don't produce them. It's an interesting indicator, and clearly you would imagine that maybe there should be something in there, but no, specifically, that's not an indicator that's included under Sdg 5.
Good. Great question, straight answer.
Absolutely, it's not there.
I actually looked that up, and there is a proposed indicator. So I went to the UN spreadsheet, and there's a lot of blank spaces. And
yeah.
For Ireland, it was collected in 2005, and that's it. So it was just a, you know, one-off. So what has to happen, it has to enter into the CSO's yearly collection of data.
Yeah, and it would be good as well if Eurostat, you know, I mean, it is such an important issue, I suppose, at EU level now as well. But, you know, I suppose we're constrained really when it comes to what data we can and cannot put into the SDGs, because we're using all the available published data. And, you know, we decide to eliminate data that's too old. I mean, Charlie, you mentioned 2005. There'd be absolutely no sense including an indicator that's that dated in the SDGs in trying to kind of track trends. So yeah, certainly that's something that should be considered. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Here's a question that could really start a lot of aggro. Would Ireland, this comes from an anonymous attendee, would Ireland's environment country index ranking improve if we had nuclear generated electricity?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, I answered this one, but I'll answer it again. I typed an answer. I mean, amongst environmentalists, there's a bit of a split in that, sure, it would definitely improve at one level because you get a lot less greenhouse gases. But you have the problem of how do you store nuclear waste, which, you know, I don't think anyone really thinks that that's been solved to anyone's satisfaction. And then you have the problem of the safety of design. And then, you know, 5-10 years ago, there was a big push in the United States. The Obama administration actually got behind it to encourage nuclear because the renewables, solar, were so expensive, but they've come down so much that nuclear power requires such heavy subsidies to make it at all affordable at the private level that I think now it might not even be competitive against wind and water and other renewable energies. So I have a lot of friends who are environmental economists, and you know, 7-10 years ago, they were very encouraging on nuclear power. I haven't heard anyone saying that in a couple of years.
Good. An interesting issue around here in due course. There's a question, interesting question from Brian Turner that brings us back a decade or more, and then links it to the present. He says it's interesting that on table 11, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, countries, those 5 countries who were the countries in trouble in the crash and the banking crisis and the bailouts and all that, that they occupy the 5 bottom places in table 11. Is that coincidental, or would the austerity imposed during the Great Recession be contributing to those rankings?
I've no doubt it probably does. Absolutely. And in fact, you know, going back over the last few years that we've been constructing that index, definitely those 5 countries are always in the bottom of the ranking. You know, they might change a little bit here and there in terms of who's last or who's second last, but certainly Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain are always in the bottom. And I have no doubt that austerity has definitely, I suppose, tied hands in terms of the ability to, I suppose, fully embrace the SDGs and push the resources and commitment and dedication that's required into them. Absolutely. It's something that we should seriously maybe look at in more detail to see whether.
I think I can say that it will be on our, it is on our research agenda, because we certainly argued very strongly at that time when Ireland was going through the bailout that austerity was the wrong way to go, the way it was being done. Okay. And I think a decade later, with the COVID crisis and so on, the world has learned. The groups like the IMF have acknowledged they probably made a mistake 10, 12 years ago in the crash. And I think maybe the view, even in the international institutions, may have changed to a point where they say austerity isn't good for well-being, to put it mildly. So we had a very different kind of approach. What I'd like to see, we had a very different approach in COVID, or to deal with COVID. What I'd like to see is that embedded in the sort of the various fiscal rules and so on at the European Commission level. And we're going to see in the next year or two how that plays out. But certainly we have every intention of having some things to say about it. So now there was a question there, but anyway, we'll ask it to Maureen O'Connell. Am I right in thinking that subjective well-being was linked to 16 SDGs, but not to the 17th one in the SDG 17? I think it actually is linked to them all.
No, the diagram.
To all 17 in the no,
the diagram just misses it. But essentially what I was looking at in putting that diagram together was where our proposals fit with those dimensions, but there would be significant other crossovers. So for example, if you look at community, social connections and cultural participation, you could probably put that up to SDG 9 in terms of industry, innovation and infrastructure, in SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, as well as SDG 16. So there will be more work in terms of the progression of this as we move forward with the wellbeing framework and the index into the future. Thank you.
Okay, a question here for Catherine, saying a nice presentation. This is from Jean Boucher, by the way. A comment: I appreciate the emphasis on ranking with EU peers, but we can also lose sight of the absolute score. Getting a 0.4, a 0.5, or a 0.6 out of 1 can be seen as weak outcomes.
No, that's valid. I suppose the reason we focus on the rankings really is because, you know, very small changes in the numbers will obviously change the rankings. And given that they are the developed countries, they do have a certain amount of similarity. But the way the index is constructed, I suppose, is the scores are an average across all 17 goals, averaged across all the indicators. So absolutely, I mean, you know, it does matter what the score is, but the countries that are scoring highest are certainly the ones that seem to be, in our view anyway, achieving better results across all of the goals. But it is an average, kind of an average. It's meant to kind of capture, I suppose, the average performance across all the different goals. Okay, so another question here for you, Catherine. This is from Martina Walsh. Are Irish breastfeeding rates accounted for in the calculations re Sdg 2? It is interesting that Ireland ranks highest for obesity rates, while also considering that we have the lowest breastfeeding rates in the region. So she has a particular interest in it because she's part of the Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland. That's the answer is
Malvina Walsh. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. The answer is no. It's not in there. It's not in there. And we remember, like when we're constructing our index, you might have some data that's available for Ireland, but for us it has to be available for all 14 countries in order that we can include it as an indicator in our SDG goal measure. So absolutely agree with you. I think that there certainly could be a distinct link there and a correlation, but we don't have the data to support including it. Maybe that'll change in the future, but certainly not at the moment. It's not available.
Good stuff. There's a follow-up question here from Caroline White, and she's thanking Charles for his reply to her question on GDP growth, which was also a similar question asked by Eric Conroy. I put the two together. But anyway, she's saying a quick comment. From my understanding, once you bring environmental costs into GDP, then you tend to end up with zero or negative GDP. So it seems that there's a need for some businesses to reorient their activities away from expansionism. But that may not be easy right now for the more heavily indebted businesses, since growth enables debt repayment. So debt seems like a central issue to be looked at. Okay. Any comment on that?
I would like to second the issue of debt, particularly business debt. It does not get much attention. It's, I think, much more serious than government debt. There has to be a way to change the accounting at all levels so that business profitability includes the costs as well as the benefits of their activities. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Good stuff.
That's certainly, sorry if I can, that's certainly something that Social Justice Ireland's been looking for in terms of, on a national stage, a set of national accounts or a set of shadow accounts to show those kind of things in terms of where there is subtraction as well as growth. But yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there was some sort of a focus during the pandemic in relation to the needs of businesses, particularly small businesses. But definitely there is more that needs to be done on the debt side there.
Okay. There's a question that came in the chat from Lucia Walsh. Why are so few indicators available for SDG 11 and SDG 13?
Yeah, good question. And, you know, I suppose, again, going back to the point I made earlier, for some of the indicators, if there's no variability at all in the data, there's no point in including it in our measure, because, you know, you could have 14 countries and they're all scoring the exact same. So there's no point in including it. I suppose for SDG 11, certainly, we'd like to see a lot more measures there. We have included an air quality measure. We have included, I think it's satisfaction. So it's meant to capture, you know, the cities and communities. So we have a measure of success survey data on public transport, and we've also got a measure in there of the extent of rent overburden, which of course unfortunately doesn't take account of the most recent developments in Ireland. But those are the three measures that we use, and I suppose at an EU level they also include ones that again aren't probably relevant to a lot of there are things like, you know, they're more cities, they're kind of overcrowding, and the extent of dwellings that are, as I say, regarded as being overcrowded. So the bottom line is we use the best data we can to try and capture what we're trying to measure and what the theme of the SDG is. So for SDG 11, we'd like to see more. For SDG 13, again, I mean, this is one of the ones that's causing a lot of problems. And, you know, because you want to have data on all the 14 countries, greenhouse gases is probably the one that's used most often. Carbon pricing is one that we think is important, and that's why we've included in there. I think CO2 emissions and, you know, CO2 emissions from cars are included in another SDG, so you don't want to duplicate again, so that's why they're not in there. But, you know, things like impact, you know, the impact and climate change initiatives, we've no way of really measuring those just now, and the Eurostat is grappling with it and the UN is grappling with it, so there's still, you know, considerable amount of work that can be done, I think, in trying to get, you know, reliable, robust data for those kind of those goals in particular.
So I think maybe we should draw a line under it there. We're over time, and we could keep discussing for a while yet, but I think we've dealt with most of the questions that have come in, and we've tried to cover them, and we've also had a wonderful hour and a half or an hour and 3/4. And I want to say a very special thanks to Professor Charles Clarke and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, who joined Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland, Catherine joining us from UCC, and Charles joining us from St. John's University in New York. And just appreciate Charles for having got up early to be set up because it's 5 hours behind our time here. So we really, really appreciate that. And
I think this is the second time I've worn a tie during COVID.
That's the first time this time last year.
Yeah, probably.
So anyway, just to draw your attention, finally, a little save the date notice here. Social Justice Ireland's annual social policy conference. I think it will be our 35th annual policy conference. It started way back in '88. This year it will be on Wednesday, the 18th of November, and the title the topic fits very well with this. What we've been discussing today is the topic is going to be towards well-being for all. Now we are lining up a very comprehensive and very wide-ranging group of speakers from different institutions and from around the world, and as well as from Ireland. And we encourage you, put the date in the diary, and we will let you know, keep you informed as we go along. But we're very grateful for everybody's attendance, for the time you've given us. Again, just to say that the actual index and the whole study is now on our website, socialjustice.ie, and can be downloaded there. And this webinar and the slides and so on will all be up there in due course. So to everybody, thank you very much for being with us and so on, especially to Charles and to Catherine and to Colette. I certainly enjoyed listening to it, and I'm sure all the other participants did as well. Thank you all so much.